story about a little girl, grew up in the Midwest. They didn't have a lot of money. Her dad was the postmaster. There were 4 children in the family. The whole time she was growing up, she kept hearing her mom talk about wishing she could go visit a favorite uncle. The uncle lived out in Wyoming, and so it was a big deal to the mom and the little girl and talking about this. And anyway, the mom and the little girl had a couple birthdays right within a couple weeks. And so for their birthday together, the dad gave the mom and the little girl 2 train tickets to go out to Wyoming. So it was the biggest thing in her whole life. She and her mom got on the train. Dad stayed with the other kids. They got out to Wyoming. The very first thing the uncle showed them was his brand new pointer hunting dog. And I was thrilled with the dog. It was a champion. It had papers. He had all kinds of plans for it. Well, evidently, the dog didn't like the little girl very much because the dog and the little girl were about the same size. The dog had been getting all the attention, and now here came the cute little girl. So the second day they were there, the dog lunged at her, bit her in the head, and almost tore her whole scalp off. Now, they quickly got her to an emergency room, but it was a while ago, and they didn't have some of the medications they have today. And for some reason, because it was so close to the brain, they felt like they couldn't give her any kind of an anesthetic. So they literally did hundreds of stitches without being able to give her anything for the pain. 2 days later, she began running 105 to 106 degree fever. The wound had gotten infected. They rushed her father out. They told her parents that she had only a 75 to 1 chance to even live, and that if she did live, she would never ever look normal. Well, the little girl did survive the infection, but she was literally a freak, and she had big hunks of scar tissue that stuck out all over her head. So her parents decided the next 2 summers to try taking her to Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, to see if they could help her. Now, I want you to just stop for a moment and think about that whole experience. What would you think her memories of all of that would be? Pretty awful? Yeah. What's absolutely amazing is she says every single memory that she has of that entire experience is positive. And it's because of little things that a handful of people did. She says when she was in that emergency room, she remembers nothing about the pain. All she remembers is the doctors and nurses touching her, holding her, talking to her, just enveloped in love. When she had the real high fever and they didn't think she'd live, this was just a tiny town in the mountains of Wyoming. And somewhere, the doctors and nurses found an 8mm movie projector. Remember those? They kind of shook. They brought it into her room, and they brought Abbott and Costello, Casper the Friendly Ghost, the Little Rascals. Her parents didn't even own a TV set, but she had movies in her room. And she says she thinks one of the reasons she fought that infection and lived was she didn't want to miss those movies. When they would go to Mayo Clinic, she and her mom would have to be there 7 to 8 weeks at a time. And in those days, they tried to create sort of a family experience. So they didn't keep children overnight in the hospital unless they absolutely had to. And what they did was they assigned a driver. The driver would pick the parent and child up at the hotel early in the morning, drive them to the hospital, and then drive them back late at night so they could sleep together. Now, the taxi driver was just a taxi driver, but he became their friend because every day he was taking them back and forth. Well, every day when he picked them up, he had this funny little furry thing that hung from the rearview mirror. And he'd say to the little girl, "Say good morning to Fred. Fred's my good luck charm. I've never had an accident because Fred takes such good care of me. Fred's my best friend in the whole world." So she thought Fred was pretty special. Well, on the day of her first surgery, he knew it was the day, picked the mom and the little girl up early in the morning, drove them to the hospital, let them out of the car, and then she said she'll never forget what he did next. He said, "Now, wait a minute." And she said he went around and he opened up the front door and he took Fred off the rearview mirror. And she said he came over and he got down on his knees so he was eye level with her. And he said, I know it's your operation today. I know you're probably kind of scared, but you know how Fred takes such good care of me? Never lets anything bad happen. You take Fred with you, and you're going to be just fine. And she says she remembers going into the surgery clutching this ugly little furry thing, whatever it was. The doctor who did her plastic surgery was the best known plastic surgeon in the world at the time. So can you imagine how busy that man was? Because they only get the worst of the worst at Mayo Clinic. When they'd bring her in to have the bandages changed, he'd never let the nurses do it. He'd always bring her in, he'd sit her up on the table, and he'd tell her all about his children and ask her lots of questions. And as he changed the bandages, and they were cloth in those days, he would somehow tear the ends of every one, and he'd tie little bows all over her head. And that was her memory, that she was so pretty. So none of those things were big things, folks. And yet they absolutely changed what could have been a horrible memory into a positive one. You know, I think about that doctor. He was changing people's lives every day, but he still had a few extra minutes for a little 5-year-old girl. My belief has become, we do not know when the extra kind, caring thing we do for someone might make a difference in their whole lives. We don't know that. That's the gift we have every single day, every day, every day. My idea of heaven has become, we'll see all the people we've touched that we know nothing about. So this is the little girl before the dog bite, her 5th birthday. And this is the little girl after the dog bite. So I couldn't even tell that story till 2 or 3 years ago. Could you tell? But, you know, it's interesting. My mom was in my audience for the first time a few years ago, right after I'd started telling it. And she sat in the back with tears rolling down. She said, my memories weren't like that at all.